Howdy, folks. So today we're going to go ahead and talk our way through really how we determine our dietary needs. So there's a number of government attempts which are doing their best. There's just obviously a lot of variability based upon how you live your life and everything else, which is going to cause it to maybe be a little bit off. How we're going to appropriately read labels and understand that there's some issues out there, and there's some ways that people can hide behind the truth, which is going to also show their way in health claims, and some that can be a little misleading. Then we're going to talk about, well, how we're going to determine needs for our macronutrients or micronutrients, and really understanding what our essential nutrients are and really defining it. So is it indispensable? Is it dispensable? Is conditionally essentially, conditionally indispensable? So if you look down at the bottom here, guys, where we have the image, an essential nutrient is something that we need in the body. We can't make it on our own. So if we don't have it, we're not going to live, grow, or be healthy. Now, conditionally essential are things that we don't always need, but depending on how our life is, we're going to need it. Now, it could be during certain points in time that's be more important, like folate with pregnant women, or things like vitamin D, where if we can get enough sun exposure, we don't actually need the vitamin, but we need to live in an area where the sun shines essentially brightly enough upon us. So once we get too high, it's either towards the North Pole or the South Pole, we're just not going to be able to get enough sun exposure for solid periods of the year. And so that's conditionally essential. Non-essential is something that, well, we don't really need it, but like anything else, it's just going to be something we naturally have that can kind of help us feel a little bit better, like fiber, because it turns out it helps a little bit with digestion and specifically evacuation of what you ate, and you can live without fiber. I just probably wouldn't suggest it. So the first basic idea we're going to have is what's known as our RDA, recommended daily allowance. Now, this is going to be effectively how much we need so that 90% of the population is not going to have any negative outcomes thanks to being deficient in it. So hence there's an RDA for calcium, for protein, for fats, for vitamin D, for vitamin A, for vitamin K, all of our essential nutrients. And we are going to have a couple different variations on this. Dietary reference intake, the DRI. This is going to be something a little bit more, essentially a little bit newer, where you're going to have underneath that blanket, we've got our estimated average requirement, and that's how much we need to have people taking in so that 50% doesn't have any negative outcomes. RDA is going to be where we're going to find that 90% of people aren't going to have issues. Adequate intake is where no one is going to have issues. And then tolerable upper intake level is going to be the point at which you're taking in so much that you're starting to hit levels of toxicity. And that can happen from literally drinking water to obviously are things like iron overload, where it's relatively easy to poison yourself if you take in too much iron supplements in a short period of time. In fact, that's the reason why you don't find it typically in multivitamins for little kids, since you can go really heavy on the B vitamins, and the worst you're going to do is turn your pee fluorescent, but you can do some damage with some minerals. And so different countries have got different guidelines. In the bottom right corner, we can see kind of the reference values of what's going to be that low level amount, even though there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, but we'll get into that more when we talk about carbs and a little bit more of the nuances of nutrition. And also when we're looking at trying to not go into those upper levels. So hence why trying to keep fat and saturated fat levels lower, which also can be a little bit misguided. And different countries, once again, different standards. So we do have effectively 40 essential nutrients. I'm not going to have you guys memorize that. That's a Dr. Google thing. That's a waste of our time. Instead, we need to understand is the basic idea of making sure individuals are eating a variety of food sources where they're going to be matching all of their needs throughout the day, and they're doing it in a way that's hopefully going to be enhancing their health. So pretty much every country has come up with their own. Back in the day, there was the food guide pyramid, and then people thought you should be at the top of the pyramid, which was fats and sweets, and you shouldn't do as many. And then grains are the base of it because I guess you love bread unless you're a celiac, and then you're going to have a heck of a time. And then there's the newer iteration where it was the happy person walking up the stairs to nowhere because we need physical activity, and then different slices of the pyramid. So once again, the proportions of what you're taking in of different dietary sources. And then finally, what we've gotten to is more of the my plate. which is where straight up you're going to be having the idea of X amount of your plate is vegetables, is fruits, is starches, is protein, and of course we need to steal the lactation of incarcerated mammals from other species, aka we need dairy. Not really, but we'll get there later. So when you're reading your labels, we're starting from top to bottom. So the first thing that we should always look at is what is a serving size. You can have cereals, which are usually the worst culprits for it, where a serving is a quarter of a cup. And don't get me wrong, if you're an infant, a quarter of a cup is a pretty decent sized serving relative to your body mass. Most of us, and especially on the commercials when they show the bowl of cereal, that probably is the equivalent of about 2 literal cupfuls, which is going to be, in some cases, potentially 8 servings. So if we know the size of the serving, from there, when we move forward, we know how many calories it is per serving. And for most people, that's the biggest effect on their diet, which is, are we in a caloric surplus where we're gaining weight, or are we in a caloric deficit where we're losing weight? As long as we got a basic idea of our total caloric intake, we're going to be able to do a good job of controlling our weight. Now, what type of weight we're increasing and decreasing is when we're starting to look more at our macronutrients. So we're looking at how many grams of fat, carbohydrate, and protein we're going to be getting in per serving. Then we can look at our micronutrients, and this can be obviously important for individuals such as someone that maybe has some issues with osteopenia, osteoporosis, aka low bone mineral density. So yeah, we want them to be taking in more calcium in the diet. Someone that has issues with anemia, we want them to be taking in more iron in the diet. So we want to then, figure out what are going to be the micros, and also what are some other things of interest. Now, obviously, if you got someone with an allergy, you are going to skip the serving size and you're going straight to the ingredient list and making sure that if they have a peanut, soy, wheat, etc. type of allergy, they're not going to be messing themselves up. So like anything else, it gives us good information. But there's some issues with the way that food labels are done in the US, which is poorly. Because since we tend to put our calories, which is a good number way to figure out energy burn, but then we have everything in grams, even though we do everything else in ounces and pounds. So we're already mixing modalities. Yay, numbers. And you're going to find certain food groups tend to have more of certain types of vitamins and minerals. Don't worry about this. This is just kind of a way of giving people a basic broad overview of why you want to eat a variety of foods, when in reality, it turns out you could survive pretty well off of nothing but essentially meat, specifically organ meats, eating the entire animal, since the carnivore diet does work and it's sustainable, though brutal, depending on how you're doing it. And you can also live off of effectively a vegan diet, except for you're going to have to do something about your B12. And you could potentially have some issues with iron, potentially. Probably not if you do it right and you do it smart. So now, here's one of my big issues here, which is the definitions of different nutrient content claims. If something has less than half a gram of different components per serving, they can say that it's free of it. So you can have 4 calories, but we can still say it's calorie free, even though that's nonsense. It's a rounding error and they're being lazy. We can say that it's fat free because it has 0.4 grams. And the same thing is to be said with trans fats. So we can hide all of these things because we have such a low number that they remove it as a rounding error. But getting back to that really small serving, if a normal serving for someone really eating that is going to be more like 8 servings, well, it turns out that 0.4 of a gram of trans fat multiplied by 8, we have 3.2 grams of trans fat. That's not good for you. And so I personally dislike how that's done, and that's something that I want you guys to be mindful of, because as long as they have certain levels underneath, they can go ahead and make these claims. Another issue is when it says reduced fat, reduced sugar, typically they're increasing the opposite. So if they reduce the sugar, they're increasing the fat. If they reduce the fat, they're increasing the sugar. They're doing something to make it taste better, or they're just increasing the sodium. Those are your kind of big 3. So some basics of different types of health claims that they can put on boxes, simply because there's been slight links to these, and some of them are very strong links between taking in enough of this can decrease your risk of that, or taking in too much of this increases your risk for that. But aside from really everything to do with fiber and folic acid, dietary fat has some issues because of the epidemiology and the way that it's performed and looked at, which we'll talk about when we get to fats. Sodium is fascinating because it is true for about 1/3 of the population, they are legitimately sensitive to sodium, and high sensitive or high sodium intakes will increase their blood pressure. So you do want to have lower sodium. Most people, meaning about 50%, it has no effect. And then less than 10% of the population have a paradoxical effect, which is when you increase their sodium, you decrease their blood pressure. So low sodium diet is actually unhealthy for them. Science is weird, but that's the reality. When you're working with millions and millions of people, you're going to have genetic variability, and you're going to have some strange effects that you wouldn't expect to see if you only had a group of 5 or 10 people. Now, when it comes to processing food and additives, processing is a really, really wide umbrella. It's anything from obviously adding a preservative to just smoking a food to drying it out, like obviously freeze drying. All of those are considered processing. So it's not so much we need to be worried about processed foods. Instead, focus more on potentially what's being added to it, what's being removed from it, and those are going to have effects upon the food. Now, we'll hopefully have a better conversation about this when we bring this up in class, or you can ask me questions about it. But just remember, it's simply going to be a process. Now, as far as the nutrition quality of food declining due to the processing, that's actually not that big of an issue. The bigger issue is actually, it's kind of more soil depletion, and then also the way these animals are raised. So when you're talking about factory farm raised cattle, chickens, etc., you actually are going to have slightly different yields of the fatty acids, of a couple other components for a wild type animal, or more of a free roaming animal, as opposed to effectively an incarcerated animal. And then when you talk about soil depletion, there's a little bit less minerals in a number of the vegetables you're going to eat, simply because of how those are effectively raised with large amounts of fertilizer and otherwise, but they're not always replenishing the other micro minerals that are going to be important for health. And sweeteners, for the most part, unless you're just doing an insane amount every single day, haven't really been shown to have major negative health outcomes, as much as they might be a little bit of a polarizing factor with a number of individuals. Now, like the debates you'll sometimes get with some people where they don't want to drink a diet soda. They'd rather drink the normal soda with the high fructose corn syrup because that's healthier. Well, you're effectively comparing garbage to garbage. If you really want to be kind of that guy, I'd say at the end of the day, you're really mincing over very slight differences. They both suck. So just drink freaking water. And if you don't like water, wham, be an adult. So in reality, now we have to ask ourselves a question about the individual. Maybe if they have some issues with like liver health or otherwise, you'd maybe want to potentially avoid some of those artificial sweeteners, but that's going to be if they have some like legit liver problems. And then even then, you probably shouldn't be working with them unless you are a registered licensed dietitian. And if they're overweight, then you probably want them to go and use the diet soda so they're not going to be taking in as many calories throughout the day. And when in doubt, guys, one of the easiest things to do to help improve somebody's diet is remove liquid calories. If you got to chew everything, it tends to slow you down a little bit and give you a little bit more satiety. So it's going to be easier for you to feel fuller and not be as hungry throughout the day. Whereas you're trying to gain weight, yeah, liquid diets are awesome. I mean, who doesn't think they can gain weight eating or drinking a lot of milkshakes, as long as you don't have a lactose intolerance or other types of dairy issues? So we're going to analyze the intakes, because like anything else, we got to know what people are doing. When in doubt, the longer records we can do and the more effective we can be with really tracking the individual metrics, the better job we're going to really have of what's going on with somebody's dietary intake and what is going to be their general overall trend. Because anybody can eat a healthy diet for a day or two, maybe even 3. So it's, they can just kind of suck it in and look better and give them, I don't know, their Instagram angle. So that way they're going to, have like, oh, like, well, they're eating a pretty good diet. So, I mean, there's no reason they should be 400 pounds. I guess they just have a slow metabolism. When in reality, the longer the average we get, the better information we're going to give you. The sad reality is, guys, how you are built, how you look, your body composition, your lean body mass, every single of those attributes about your body are all the average of all of your inputs. So your average caloric intake, your exercise, your recovery, so your sleep, your stress in your life, all of those filtered through your genetics, gives you the body you have right now. Yeah, that's not fair. There's some people that can do body by McDonald's and just be rocked up and be in great shape. And there's other folks that have to eat really healthy in order for them just to try to be what would be considered a normal body fat percentage. You can't help genetics. It's unfortunate as of the recording right now. It's just a fact of life. Now, we can still change ourselves, and that requires deliberate effort, and that requires obviously being honest and figuring out what's going on. So duplicate food collections, we're having to do it more than once. 24-hour recall, just have them kind of walk through what they did the day before. And same thing with the food frequency questionnaire, kind of how often you eat this or that. It can be pretty easy to find trends. If you find somebody's drinking two 2-liter bottles of Pepsi, Coke, whatever types of carbonated garbage product, yeah, that's a lot of liquid calories every day that's putting them in the wrong direction. Like, I think I got an idea of why they can't lose weight. And the antithesis can easily be true, where you can go through, okay, what do you have for breakfast? You didn't eat breakfast. What do you have for lunch? You had a bagel. Oh, what do you have for dinner? You had a lean cuisine. I think I know why you're not gaining weight. You don't always have to use really high precision methods. Most people, a lot of the solutions you're going to find are relatively simple. They don't necessarily want to do them, but the solutions are going to be there. And then dietary history, just like doing the food frequency questionnaire and recalls, you get an idea of what people prefer. What would be the things that they are going to be more likely to want to eat? What are things that they like to eat a little bit less? What type of life around convenience do they have? All of this is just trying to give us information so that we can make better decisions with trying to help people make their own better decisions. Because as we're going to be talking about more and more as the class goes on, our goal is never to think of a diet as a objective. Like once we cross this finish line, I will be happy. The universe will open up. The world will give me everything I want. It doesn't work like that. Instead, it's about a lifestyle. What can they maintain for a really long period of time? Because the reality is, whatever method people use to lose the weight or gain the weight, it's very similar to the method they have to use to maintain that for the rest of the time. And if they have no interest in being keto for life or carnivore for life or vegan for life or whatever method they work and use, then we have to find something that is sustainable, something they can do and enjoy for the long haul. Because Lord knows, food is an interesting thing, because it turns out it's interesting in that it's sometimes referred to as the worst addiction, because you have to still eat. You can't get around it. Now, I don't envy anyone that has, like, obviously the time of recording of this, when you talk about an opiate addiction, yeah, that's absolutely horrible. But we can send you on an island where there's no opiates. Like, yeah, it's going to hurt. You're going to DT. You're going to feel like garbage. But eventually they're going to dry out. And as long as there's no opiates there ever again, they're going to be fine. Now, I don't know if a lot of people want to live on a desert island, and Lord knows during this pandemic, you probably already feel like you're on a desert island in certain points if you're doing a good job of social distancing. But the reality is, with food, you still have to make a deal with the devil multiple times per day, and you got to do that every day for the rest of your life. So it can be very difficult. And the other sad fact, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, which is anorexia nervosa, of all the psychological disorders or diagnoses you can have, I apologize if I use the wrong term there, it actually has the highest lethality rate. So food is a very interesting thing and can be quite dangerous if we are not appropriately managing our relationships with it. Now, when it comes to all of those essential minerals, fatty acids, vitamins, and amino acids, here's the list. You're never going to have to memorize it, guys. And a number of them you don't need near as much. Once you start getting all the way into, gold and rubidium, samarium, yeah, that's not really a thing. They're just kind of throwing things on there. I just like it because it gives you a basic. You really only need omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid, alpha-linoleic acid, and linoleic acid, along with our basic 16 vitamins and vitamin D. If we get no sunshine, once again, we don't need to take it in through the diet, and our 12 amino acids. So thanks for listening, guys. Have a great day.